Welcome to Pet Business Disruptors. I'm Clayton and I am here today with Graham Matheson, who is one of the co-founders of Tavati, a herbal medicine, I'm going to call it that, which originates in the Cook Islands. Thanks a million for coming on, Graham, and joining me all the way from Australia.
Oh, thanks, Clayton. Nice to be here. Really excited and interested to get involved in this business.
Yeah, so tell us about you, first of all, and then how that sort of links into the product and how it links into where you're sort of coming into the pet industry from.
Okay, so I'm a medical doctor by training, and I'm from the Cook Islands. I grew up in the Cook Islands, and I came to Australia to do medical school, and I currently live in Sydney and practice in Sydney, and my family are still in the Cook Islands, and that's where we grow and refine Tavasi in the Cook Islands. My journey into this was actually more interested in injuries. So growing up in the Cook Islands, I was played a lot of sport, played a lot of rugby. I represented the Cook Islands in rugby and athletics, and you get a lot of injuries. And through medical school, you had to do research projects, and I did a research project assessing fracture healing and non-invasive means of assessing the healing strength of bones, mostly using sound transduction. And then that got me involved in the Surgical and Orthopedic Research Laboratories with Bill Walsh, which was one of the world's premier surgical and orthopedic research labs. And then I followed that up by doing a master's in biomedical engineering in that lab on tendon repair. And I broke my leg. And I broke my leg playing rugby, and that wasn't much fun. And that was while I was doing my master's. And one of my other mates, Anthony, broke his leg. And he had a nasty compartment syndrome, almost lost his foot. Was told he's never going to run again, probably lucky to walk again. And I saw him and he said, I'm off home to Raro and I'm going to get some Maori medicine on him. So next summer, I'm back home and we're playing soccer together. And we're like, oh, and this kind of story was pretty typical in the Cook Islands. And so while I was finishing off my master's, I said, look, we've got all these products here that we're testing for other companies around the world. We've got bone morphogenic proteins and bone grafts and bone graft substitutes and stem cells. And back in Raro, we seem to have treatments that get people back on the field in 6 weeks. So any chance we can have a look at that? So I went back to the Cook Islands. I had a meeting with the Clayton, who's the traditional custodians of Cook Islands culture, and they unanimously agreed to do a joint venture project to research and develop it. And so I brought some plant extracts back to Australia. We did some studies on fractures, and we were very, very pleasantly surprised to see that we got new cartilage and new bone growth into fractures very quickly. And we got it into a bone graft, a defect, which was our probably seminal study, where we took a 20 millimeter gap in a bone and we treated it topically, transdermally, so not on the actual injury itself. And we got new bone growing in that defect in 1 week. And that's when our project actually really began. And so we spent a lot of time trying to determine which plants were causing this and how we would best get that effect out. And we published a PhD on it, and we published patents around the world securing this information. So that's sort of where Tavati came from. And Tavati actually is an abbreviation for Te Vairako Ati. And Te Vairako is the word we use for medicine in the Cook Islands. Its literal translation would mean plant juice, but all medicines are called Vairako. So Vairako Ati is a bit hard to pronounce, so Tavati was the choice of word when we commercialized it. So that's the origin of this. I was doing all this working through as a doctor at the time. And, everyone has their little road to Damascus moment for a lot of projects. And for me, it was when I spilt the stuff all over the bench and had to wipe it all up. We were in a hurry and got it all over myself, and woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning where my fracture injury from the year before was suddenly causing me a whole bunch of discomfort. And then within the next several days, I was walking much pain-free. And so my personal experience was that this was making a big difference to myself. And that was one of the major drivers for persisting with their project throughout the last 20 odd years. And to get into the pet industry, you want to find out how we end up here. This was an oddly convoluted path. So in 2019, I was actually asked by the Cook Islands to develop a product from our traditional medicines to reintegrate into our healthcare system. Cook Islanders would be able to use traditional medicines as part of their normal social lives. So I began to develop that product, and that's the origin of Tavati itself. And then word of mouth spread that we had this product and athletes wanted to use it. And because elite athletes with injuries have a very, very vested interest in trying to get back in the field quickly. From that point, we ended up getting the sports anti-doping lawyers to give us some advice, because all it is a single plant extract from the Cook Islands and coconut oil. But we wanted to make sure that we had followed all the correct methods. And from these guys, the horse racing and greyhound racing industry became very interested. And again, all through word of mouth. And with the greyhounds and horses, we're getting some fantastic results initially with their injured animals who had been retired. But then these retired animals started racing again. And they started using them on not just their racing animals, but their other animals. And so Tavati Pet was actually developed in response to trainers and vets asking for products for us to make for companion animals. And that's how we actually ended up in making and becoming in the pet industry, is because we had a product that was improving injuries, and it was all by word of mouth, and we got requested to produce products. And so oddly enough, this is how we ended up here.
Yeah, so in terms of like what it does, how does it work, and like what can it actually help with? Because obviously, like when I've looked at it, and it seems to obviously help regrow bone. But does it work? What else is it worth? Is it worth for cartilage? Is it worth for things like hip dysplasia? I mean, what would be the range of benefits that it can produce, and also like how does it actually do what it does?
That's a very, very good set of questions. The first answer is I don't know how it does what it does. It is applied to the skin, it gets through the skin, and it influences the injured tissue where that injured tissue is. So whether you rub it on your leg or your arm or your back, and it seems to get through the skin and systemically treat. That type of mechanism of action just means it's soluble in oil, which is obvious in the sense that it is actually delivered in oil, and that's how it gets through the skin. We don't have any good correlating mechanism of action for the process that it does what it does. So we are seeing it influence bone healing in the initial phase, in the first week. We're seeing it influence bone healing in the weeks 6 to 8, including bone remodeling. So we don't have a clear known mechanism by which that type of activity occurs. There are also some intriguing slides in our histology that show a continuum between some connective tissue, cartilage, and bone, which has also not got a well-known mechanism that we can correlate it to. So in short, we don't actually know how it works, and even the actual ingredients that would be in there. Our Tavati coconut oil mixture has been close to impervious to analysis by mass spectrometry, separation chemistry in a meaningful way, which is actually been quite a challenging process from our end. But talking to people who are more familiar in this sort of space in terms of plant extracts and things, that doesn't seem terribly surprising to many of them. So what we do know is it influences bone healing, but almost all of our veterinary experience is based almost entirely on the vet's experiences. So our preclinical studies in terms of bone and soft tissue were almost all designed to direct our securing of patents. So the securing of patents was very, very important, because in order for the traditional leaders and I to disclose what the traditional medicine was, we would have to have acquired patents in order to protect it. Otherwise, we would have just disclosed the information to the rest of the world and lost it entirely. So most of the preclinical studies were done to secure intellectual property protection, which was part of the conditions of the traditional leaders agreeing to participate in the project. Almost all of the veterinary things is directly from the trainers and the vets themselves. And they have their feedback suggests that it improves bone and soft tissue injuries, including tendon injuries and hoof injuries. And I'm not entirely sure the mechanisms of action for that. We know it doesn't cause bone to grow unless there's an injury. So we know it doesn't just produce bone like a bone growth hormone. It just seems to accentuate injury repair, and we're not entirely sure why.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of how it sounds to me is like it's a bit almost stem cellish in a sense, in that like it's like it almost puts like a repair. Like I looked into stem cell treatments years ago, and it was like they were able to filter out the repair gene of the stem cells and then inject them into people, and that would actually stimulate growth rather than to stimulate repairs rather than, let's say, like a bone hormone and like just grow bone per se, you know. So it seems to obviously liven up the repair genes which we have, or something like that. Would you say
Yes,
that?
I would think that that's probably the closer analogy, or a bit like a endorphin and enkephalin processes, where they're signaling molecules that upregulate your cells, but they by themselves don't actually tell the cells what to do. They just upregulate their repair and injury repairs processes, which you switch it on from stable mode to repair mode, and that seems to be what is facilitating a very broad range of injury repair processes um, you know, from blood vessel formation to new cell formation and migration, but it's not doing it in an inflammatory manner, so I'm not entirely sure why that's the case either. Because if it was an inflammatory process, it wouldn't be continuing to affect it into the sort of 4 to 6 week time frame.
Yeah. So if we just stick with the business case, first of all, how hard was it to actually get those patents for something which is effectively a natural medicine?
It was really hard. There's a couple of very challenging aspects to getting it as a natural medicine. The first of all is something as traditionally used is very difficult to state that it is novel because it's been around for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. And you have to then show that you have defined effects. The process by which we developed this project was essential to getting the intellectual property. So the Koizunui partners of it and the intellectual property that is the traditional knowledge forms part of our patent base. And we actually commissioned a study by ethnobotanists to rewrite a lot of the paperwork and notes that are done from the and to tell us whether or not other cultures around the world actually use this plant for the same purposes. And we found that the use of these plants for bone and soft tissue injuries was unique to the Cook Islands. We got objections from the Chinese and the Indian patent offices because they claimed that their traditional medicines would cover this and it would not be possible to patent it. And both of those objections were overcome with our data and evidence. I believe it's the first time our patent offices has ever overcome an objection from the Chinese patent office. So we successfully defended those claims against the other traditional medicine claims, and we also successfully defended our claims against with the biological results that we managed to show.
Yeah, no, it's it just sounds like a very tough idea to actually get that global patenting, because obviously, things like China, they're getting patents to stick there is actually really tough. So yeah, so what are the main treatments for it? So when they say I'm a customer looking for Tavai, like what would be the main things which, I mean, I know we've talked about bone repair, bone growth, but the potential to actually help things like cartilage. Is there any other types of things which would find it, especially in pets, where it can help?
Yeah, it seems very useful in chronic or recurrent injuries, because many recurrent injuries, and not just in pets but in most humans and other animals, is actually minor injuries actually recurring rather than something just being chronically persistent. So a lot of pain from arthritis is due to tiny little cracks occurring in the bones. A lot of joint pain is actually recurrent injury to the ligaments, and so a lot of the pain and discomfort we have is actually due to ongoing and recurring injuries, as opposed to just joints and bones and not being stiff and sore. In the same way, stress fractures are continuums through to real fractures. They're not. They start with a little bit of a sore shin, but they're actually the small cracks that are appearing early on. And so what we seem to find is that for recurring injuries or recurring discomfort, we're finding a lot of feedback suggesting that this is very, very useful. And surprisingly to me, not just in the bones. We're getting a lot of feedback that other soft tissue injuries are showing signs of clinical improvement. And to me, one of my favorite things about entering into the animal space was actually the racing animals, because they never have any sort of placebo effect. They want to run, and if they can't run, they won't, and if they get better, they'll run again. And so very much of our feedback has actually become from the trainers that train racing animals, because their experiences are much more obvious to them, and their feedback to us was that they are getting very good results in animals that may not have such defined injuries but have not been able to perform at their usual levels. And this is one of the main driving force for this is actually from feedback from the vets.
I suppose the big thing with like racing animals or anything, even humans involved in sport, is that you are pushing yourself to an extra degree which normal people aren't. So if it isn't genuinely working, it's very easy to for things to break down again. I think would be the thing. So, and also there would be more than just like a time factor as well, because sometimes let's say you take a supplement to like ease pain in something, and quite often it would have gone away anyway, just with the sort of benefits of time. Whereas if you're actually involved in a high performance sport, that isn't the case.
Yes, that's true. And one of the horse trainers actually told me something which I hadn't thought about before. Was he said, if you're a herd animal, you never pretend to be lame, because lame animals get eaten.
That's true. That's true. And yeah, that, I mean, look, it's like that for chickens, for example. If you've got one chicken amongst the whole load and it's looking rough, the others will take it out, to be honest. Or I remember, I forget who it was talking about the zebras, and apparently with zebras, the reason you can't mark them, let's say if you mark them, they stand out from the crowd. So then the natural targets for any predators. So yeah, no, I totally get that.
Yeah, and so it's been a very interesting ride through this. So the irony is that we've gotten to this project has a few different facets also that sort of got to where it is. So we were actually strangely one of the UN development program supported projects, because one of the other aspects of our project was actually the access and benefit sharing agreements that we did. I just wanted to say something about that, because the Global Environment Facility was actually funding the development of Tavati for 4 years, because it was a program that the UN tried to develop. Do you remember there was these millennial goals from the UN, and they had a whole bunch of projects that they wanted to get on track, and they were talking about getting poverty reduction and healthcare initiatives, and they did an interim report in 2015, and the only one that was on target was actually our Tavati project, which was literally the only project in the entire book that actually could tick off a successful goal that was achieved, because we were the one single project in the entire world that actually brought a product towards market due to a UN goal.
Yeah, the UN Sustainable. I think it was the UN Sustainable Goals Initiative, so Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, or something like that. I think it was called, and
That was the
most of,
one.
most of them are just clearly nonsense, to be honest. So I did a bit of my master's in international development, and so the more you
Oh,
look at
did
that
you?
sort of yeah. So the more you look at that sort of stuff, the more nonsensy it gets generally, to be honest. So no, it's
Oh, look, I actually have to agree, just quietly. I have a quadrupole mass spectrometer in our lab in the Cook Islands, because it was part of the grant. This is a very, very CSI high-tech and analytical piece of equipment. And I'll give you a little logistical, just a little aside there, right? To run one of these things in the Cook Islands is just a little bit of a challenge, right? Because it has to use a gas to carry the molecules. We can't get helium in the Cook Islands, so we have to use hydrogen, which means you have to manufacture your own hydrogen, which means you have to get ultra pure water, which means you have to distill and then separate the water. And so we have this entire chemistry set up just to get the gas, just to run it. And I told them I actually don't need this, but they said, well, it's part of the grant, so you have to have it. So
that sounds about right for these grants. Is that it's just more about finding a home for the money than it is to actually put something useful into play. I mean, it's the money that goes into these things is insane, and also their objectives can be quite. I mean, I remember doing a project on carbon flaring. Was it carbon flaring in the Niger Delta, and it was they were getting a load of carbon credits for it, but it was something they'd banned about 3 years earlier anyway, and they had to get rid of it by law, but they were still getting rid of it and getting a load of carbon credits and a load of money on top. It was just bizarre. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever sort of come across and worked on, to be honest. So,
oh, is that where they're flaring the gas off the wells, and then they're
yeah,
claiming that if they stop doing that, they get a carbon reduction?
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
dull.
but even though they had to do it by law because it was dangerous and it was like literally absolute chaos, but they were like, oh yeah, but we've got this great carbon reduction, so here's some carbon credits which you can now sell on the carbon markets to the likes of Avis, who then can market themselves as being carbon neutral. It's like bizarre. Like the more you dig into these things, there's a lot of hypocrisy and weirdness going on, to be honest.
Yes, it was. I have to say, not just the hypocrisy, the bureaucracy was fun. Gating grant processes and grant reporting processes was very, very Interesting process, nevertheless. Yes, but this, on the other side, it was actually quite good for the Cook Islands in the sense that it did facilitate bringing all of the technology that we'd used to develop Tavati back to the Cook Islands, and that was one of the actual objectives of it. And so that was probably the most useful thing from my point of view. So all of the scientific technology that was used to develop Tavati actually got transferred back to the Cook Islands, and so the entire process is done now in the Cook Islands. So all of our extraction, refining, standardization is done on site in the Cook Islands. So the product exported from the Cook Islands is the finished, refined, and standardized product. So we're not exporting plant material or biomass. We're actually exporting a refined and finished product.
Which is actually pretty impressive, because it's kind of almost against what I think the World Bank have done for years. So when I used to be involved in the nut industry, there was this thing with Mozambique where they were producing, like, one of the biggest producers of cashew nuts, and they needed money from the World Bank. So the World Bank said, "Look, we'll give you the money, but on the basis that you allow unshelled cashew nuts to leave the country, because there's a poisonous shell that goes around the cashew nut." The Mozambican government used to have huge tariffs if you wanted to export them, and World Bank made them get rid of it and destroyed all their shelling industry. So, I mean, to be honest, normally speaking, when it comes to anything to do with the UN and actually like creating value-added product, it usually goes in the other direction. So, I mean, it's actually really good that it's produced out there effectively. So with
Yeah. Also, from our point of view, we don't want to be exporting large amounts of plant volume. Like, that's the last thing we want to be doing, is stripping our country of its natural resources and shipping them overseas unless it's actually beneficial. So in this way, we actually only take out what's necessary, and we ship out the useful part from the country, but not taking entire plantations down to stick on ships.
Yeah. And also, look, the cost of transporting stuff from the Cook Islands, I wouldn't imagine it's cheap either, because it's not exactly geographically located somewhere where the freight lanes are particularly economic. It's not like shipping from, like, China to the east, to the west coast of America or something.
No, it is geographically located in such a way that if you turn the Earth so that half the Earth was water, we're like smack in the middle of that spot. Like, we are literally in the furthest spot away from almost anything else.
So logistically, like, how hard do you find it to send the stuff abroad? But also, like, there must be because I don't know what the population of the Cooks is, but I'm going to have a stab and say it's about 10,000 people.
Between 10 and 15,000 permanent residents, probably double that when you add the transient people that will be there for holiday or otherwise. But yeah, it's very small. There's more people in Cronulla here.
So it just like, how do you find that in terms of like a cap on, let's say, the natural ability of the country to produce product?
It's a significant consideration. It's a small country. We are able to produce product to a sustainable level, and I'm not terribly concerned about our ability to demand in the short term. It would be a problem if we were to do it in a typical way, where they say we want several hundred ton of this to flood the market so we can get as much as we can in a short amount of time. And so we actually harvest in a particularly sustainable, traditional way, in the sense that we don't actually cut the tree down. We take off no more than a third of the bark on a limb of a tree, so that the rest of the tree continues to grow as if nothing had happened. And so we do a non-destructive harvesting method, because that's kind of important, and because the trees have roles in the ecosystem other than helping humans. And we don't have terribly much interest in taking more than is necessary. So for people that believe this is very useful for them, then we are very, very happy to facilitate treating them. But we don't really have an interest in just taking as much as we can to sell as much as we can for the short-term gain. My family's from the Cook Islands, and it's going to be in the Cook Islands for as long as we can conceive. And so it's very important for my family to behave in a way that is a very, very long outlook. And so we don't have an interest in taking as much as possible for the short term. We have an interest in something that is sustainable and durable and considerate to the rest of the people in the Cook Islands. And so we can't go flood Amazon with 10 million orders tomorrow, but we don't want to either. We simply want to meet the market demand that actually has a benefit, because that's been one of the core reasons for this project. 20 years ago, when I was talking to the president of the Clayton, one of the reasons that the traditional leaders agreed to do this is that we are beneficiaries of the medicines of the rest of the world. If we get an infection, we're using an antibiotic developed elsewhere. You have a heart attack or heart disease, we're using drugs developed elsewhere. And the rationale for approving the project was that if we have knowledge that would help other people elsewhere, then it's our obligation to share that knowledge in a way that's useful.
So just like looping back on the benefits. So I think we said obviously there's the bone growth aspect, which then also can help with things like arthritis. So like what sort of pets will you be targeting in terms of for the product? I mean, obviously at the moment you have the high performance animals like greyhounds and horses, but let's say I've got just a standard pet. What would be the sort of ailments that I'm most likely to get, which Tavai would really help with?
Mostly the people or the animals that are going to benefit are the ones whose mobility is constrained. If they're uncomfortable in their movement, if they're unable to move freely, because it has such a compounding effect. If the animal is stiff and unable to move and unable to walk, and it does less, it becomes a vicious circle. The less it does, the less it's able to do. And very often what we're finding is that animals are returning to a much more sprightly state when they're being treated, and this sort of leads to more movement. And very often, as you might know, with a lot of these conditions, many of the solutions is actually the more movement. So if you can get them pain-free and moving free, able to move more normally, once you start moving more normally, many of the other components actually improve. And this is true not just of pets, but of humans. If you walk with a limp, you'll have pain elsewhere. If you can improve the pain that causes your limp, you improve your overall function much more dramatically than just the removal of pain. And so there seems to be the improvement in movement and function that improves the overall well-being.
It's funny you say that because I've obviously done my knees in and my ankles in from years of playing soccer and other sports. And one thing I find is that I can't go on running machines anymore because it actually, where I run funny because my ankles and knees hurt, ends up throwing my hip out now. So I'm like, there is a compounding effect because the more sort of like more distressed you actually move, you end up putting excess weight onto other areas to sort of compensate.
Yes, and I think that's quite important in all types of healthcare, including especially pets, because the pets can't really tell you; they can only show you. And that seems to be the fairly dramatic effects that we're being told, is that an animal's overall well-being appears to improve is probably because of that compounding effect, where the inability to move one joint or the discomfort in one area causes a compounding effect elsewhere, and then it causes obviously a psychological effect, which then exacerbates everything else.
So if I was using the product, like let's say I've got a senior dog who's got a bit of arthritis and that sort of stuff, how quickly does it actually work? Like once you actually apply it, I mean, is it a daily product you massage in, or is it a one and done, or is it a weekly thing? And then how long would I take to notice the actual differences in the animal?
It's a daily product. It doesn't work instantly, so it's not a painkiller in the sense that you take it and the pain goes away in a few, half an hour to an hour. It's a product that you massage into the skin, and the typical effects is a gradual reduction in the difficulty and pain and movement over the next, say, 3 to 4, 5 days. And typically, the effects are noticed within a week, and it's sort of a gradual. Things are just moving better and they hurt less over a period of several days. And depending on the nature of the injury and the recurrence of it, if it's an acute injury and it resolves, then after a month's treatment, then most likely, if they were previously pain-free and moving normally, they will return back to being pain-free and moving normally after the month's treatment. If it's a recurring injury, then as you stop it, if that injury is a recurring process, then you may notice that the discomfort may return after you cease it. And for several animals and humans, ongoing use is very beneficial. And for acute injuries and otherwise uninjured animals, then it would probably require only a month's worth of treatment, and maybe 2, and then they'll return to their normal baseline.
What about as a preventative thing? So obviously, like within let's say dogs, for example, we have some very large very large breeds which do have bone and structural issues. Would that be something that you would recommend using as like a preventative, or is it a sort of a cure rather than a prevention?
I couldn't really say that it would prevent an injury. Injuries are typically a mechanical thing, and my understanding of how Tsavati works at the moment is that it upregulates repair. So it wouldn't really so much prevent injuries as it may assist in repairing minor injuries before they become more apparent. In my opinion, for growing puppies or growing humans, I would tend to say that the less you intervene in them, the better, unless there's a specific condition you're trying to treat. That's my opinion. My opinion is most bodies are remarkable, how they transform and grow, and the processes by which it occurs. And my personal opinion in that regard is that intervening as little as possible in how that nature is doing that is probably the best way to go through it. And they tend to heal and repair very, very well. So young and growing animals and of all types tend to have phenomenal injury repair capacity. And so unless there's a reason for it to be impaired or for it to be delayed or it's being delayed, my general rule would say allow them to repair themselves if they're a young animal.
Yeah. No, it was just out of interest, just to see what the scope of it was. What's the so what's the sort of most extreme cases you've actually treated with it, like both as selling it and also in your studies?
The most extreme cases in the studies was actually we had two studies. One was a critical defect. We took a 20 millimeter gap out of a bone, and this is a non-healing defect. This was done because the control results are always zero, because nothing grows in these things, especially in a very short time frame. And we got new bone growing into a critical defect in 1 week. And that was the most extreme. And that was actually the trigger for our project to really change my entire trajectory of how I did my work and work-life balance to make sure that this project would go ahead. But yeah, getting new bone into a non-healing defect in a week was probably the most dramatic. And the other more dramatic one from our studies was in a spinal fusion model, where we take bone grafts from the animal and put it between two vertebrae and sort of fuse the vertebrae together. And we not only got the grafts to stick, we actually got new bone with marrow in 6 weeks. So it actually fused as a completely new bone mass, including bone marrow, into that joint. And the graft where we took it from in the hip had healed. So the donor side had healed. So that was the most dramatic from that point of view. Feedback from vets that have been treating animals, the calls that we get that are probably they are the most astounded with is where they can't find where the injury was on their imaging.
So
When they're looking to find how it is healed, and then they're trying to find where the injury was so that they can compare it. Because when they're re-imaging them, they're having great difficulty finding where the actual original injury was. So that's probably the more dramatic ones we're hearing back from vets.
I mean, the big barrier to anything new, which people aren't aware of, is actually like dealing with the skepticism. How are you overcoming that with vets? Because obviously, I know you can say put it in people's hands, they use it, it works, but it's tough. It's tough to get around and see people one at a time, to be honest, and actually get that into people's hands. How have you been finding that side of it?
The skepticism is actually intrinsically skepticism is not a problem. Skepticism that is dismissal is a lot more difficult. And to be honest, a large number of people are going to dismiss you, and nothing that you're going to say is going to make a difference. But that goes with a lot of life. The challenge is that there isn't a comparable thing. So it's very familiar to people to take a pill or to have a food that has a proposed effect. It's very difficult for people to comprehend that you can rub something on your skin and it will fix an injury somewhere else. You rub it on your thighs to help a back injury is very difficult conceptually, because there's very little that we have out there that is similar. And there's also nothing in the market that actually has there's no non-invasive way of improving bone or cartilage injuries at the moment. So there is no current medication or treatment or system that you can say it works like this, because there really isn't one. So we have three major sources of skepticism. We have a tradition, which originally takes a lot of skepticism to start. It is applied transdermally and absorbs through the skin to influence the injury elsewhere, which also generates a lot of skepticism. And it is improving injuries in a way that we don't have a current precedent for, which also generates a lot of skepticism. So we tend to get the skepticism a lot, and that's fine. I have biological data that makes this plausible, which is great, but also um, there is no defined clinical studies that have been done on a large scale, so that's fine as well. So we have information enough to make ourselves believe that this is plausible and we should progress, but we don't have large-scale clinical trials that would be able to say this is definitively what's going to happen for this condition. Just to be clear, that's the main reason we're getting it out of the market is because there's been a demand for it, because most of the people that are most supportive of us were the most skeptical to start, but the clinical results that they're finding in their own personal experiences is the major driver for it. So the major overcoming component to the skepticism was actually skeptics that use it.
I mean, that's the thing with plant medicine, though, isn't it? It's very different to, let's say, pharmaceutical medicine, because there's a lot of things where we just don't understand how plant medicine works a lot of the times. And I think that can give people skepticism. So, yeah, like without like being too crass, like something like magic mushrooms, for example, like understanding how that can actually, stimulate the brain in ways we don't even understand. And I think whenever we look at plant medicine and compare it against refined pharmaceuticals, you're going to get skeptics, but then you're also going to get people who are on board. And once people use it and they understand like the benefits of it, it's revolutionary for people, and it's a natural product which people can actually use and feel comfortable actually giving.
Yeah, and people forget that almost half of all of our modern medicines are of natural origin. We just refined them a lot further, and people tend to forget that the core of modern medicine actually originated from traditional medicines. It's only in the last 40, 50 years that designer medicine has become a thing, where you define a pathway and then look to find a chemical to alter that pathway. Most of the core of modern medicine actually originated from discoveries rather than inventions. So they're just discovering that something worked. For example, only a few years ago, artemisinin developers got a Nobel Prize. And artemisinin is a drug that has eradicated malaria from China and from almost most of the rest of the world. And this was actually a project, if you want to take a historical view, where the Vietnamese were asking the Chinese for help in the war. And the Chinese says, what is your biggest problem? And they said, our biggest problem is malaria kills more soldiers than bullets. And so they ran a major research program into eradicating malaria. And part of that program was actually assessing all of their historical records to find out whether or not anyone in their ancient history knew how to treat malaria. And artemisinin was actually developed from a plant that was in a recipe that was more than 3,000 years old. And even in that recipe, there were some variabilities, and they had to find out from another variable recipe that suggested that you actually had to keep the water cool in order to successfully extract this, because usually you boil it like a tea, and the medicine was variable and wouldn't work. And so it was actually from Chinese traditional medicines and traditional knowledge that passed down that actually allowed them to discover the plant that had artemisinin in it and successfully eradicated malaria from the largest malaria base in the world. And so many of our modern medicines, no one is going to think about that story when they get a prescription for the drug, because the modern drug is changed in order to make it easier to make a pill, in order to make it a once daily dose, in order to make it, maybe slightly safer or metabolized differently. And so we think that this drug is a pharmaceutical in that sense. But in terms of its origin and the reason why we did it was because it was noted by very astute people that this plant, used in a very specific way, was very useful for some people. And that's the core of medicine. We seem to have forgotten a lot of that.
Yeah. No, definitely. How do you what's your plans for getting the product out? I mean, obviously you're an Australian Cook Island company at the moment. What's your sort of long-term strategy? And because I know you serve it to people across the world at the moment in the horse racing greyhound fields. But what's the long-term plan for Tavati Pet?
So for Tabati Pet, what we're going to do is we're going to manufacture it actually in Florida, in the USA, and we're going to produce it in small little daily dispensing vials to make it nice and easy. The appropriate dose for your pet comes in a 0.5 ml vial. And so you just squeeze a once daily dose and it'll come in a box of 30 for a month. Tailored the system to make it a lot easier, a lot less mess without having to measure drops or anything. So we've got the right dose dispensed and distributed for each day, and make it easy for the user to use. It's a simple daily dose where you can just drop it on the back of your pet and rub it in. And that's going to be the core of our project. And what we're trying to do is we're selling it directly to consumer online, but also our aim is to see for people that are requiring it on an ongoing basis, a subscription basis. For Tavati is our preferred model in no small part, so that we can make sure that we're only taking the amount of plant material out of the Cook Islands that is necessary, that people are finding beneficial. So we would prioritize meeting demand for product that is known to be useful over making large amounts of product that we would then, hope to find new consumers every month giving it a go.
Yeah. And just like logistically, like how do you get it out of the Cook Islands at the moment? Do you fly it out or does it go by ocean freight?
No, we fly it out. We get, the tens of kilograms of plant material is extracted down and it's refined down in negative pressure evacuation system. So we remove all the solvents and we concentrate it down into the coconut oil. And so what we export is just a concentrated extract in coconut oil. So we export that by air freight, and that's exported to the facility that will then mix it into the dispensing vials. So sea freight from the Cook Islands is very, very variable, especially in the cyclone seasons.
Yeah, I bet. So, Graham, if people want to get a hold of you, if people want to get a hold of Tavati, what's the best way to do it? How can they best get a hold of the company and get a hold of you?
So Tavati.com and Tavati Pet are online, and we're also available on Insta and Facebook. So if they want to get hold of us, we're beginning our production next month, and we should be available for sale within 2 months.
Awesome. Thanks a million for coming on, Graham. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Clayton.